but for most, it's going to stay pretty dry.
The same can be said for North East England. Again, it will be mostly fine afternoon, but you can't rule out 1 or 2 showers, with temperatures peaking in the low 20s. Not bad.
Well, let's head to Scotland, where it's going to be a cloudy afternoon for much of the country. Towards the north and west, there'll be some rain, while southern parts have the best chance of some sunshine.
And a couple of sharp showers. It's interesting, sharp showers. They're likely in Northern Ireland, but it will not be as wet here, and there should still be some bright and sunny spells around.
So, some further rain for Scotland this evening. Any isolated showers will die out, leaving a dry night. And that's how your weather's looking today.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News. Coming up this morning on The Political Correction, we'll be talking about the energy price cap, the BBC and Postal strikes, that plus much more after your latest headlines with Polly.
Very good morning. It's 10 o'clock. I'm Polly Middlehurst with your latest news headlines. A huge package of financial support has been promised by the government to help struggling households through the energy crisis. The Prime Minister has written an article in the Daily Mail newspaper where he acknowledged bills are going to be eye-watering and the next few months are going to be tough. He said colossal sums of taxpayers' money is already being used to help people, and his successor will announce more support next month. Well, the 2 Tory leadership candidates are yet to reveal exactly how they plan to ease the cost of living crisis. Rishi Sunak's team has criticised reports that Liz Truss plans to cut VAT by 5%. It's understood the Foreign Secretary has discussed a nuclear option with her advisers, which would reportedly save the average household more than £1,300 a year. Mr Sunak's campaign says the move would cost more than £30 billion. Well, Ms Truss has also vowed to bolster Britain's defences if she becomes Prime Minister, and would push ahead with renewing Trident. Setting out her plan to protect the UK, she says the era of complacency is over. Retired British Army officer Major General Tim Cross told GB News, with Russia a continued threat, the UK needs to reconsider its defence and foreign policies.
Over these last 20 years, we have become complacent. We never really put sufficient resources in terms of military into Iraq or Afghanistan, and we weren't prepared to stay there for the length of time that we had been involved in, for example, the Cold War. So I think we have been complacent, and what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and indeed elsewhere, I mean, autocracies, dictatorships, China, and so on, has made people realise that we do need to think again about how we're going to engage in not just defence policy, but foreign policy and other aspects of our external relationships as well.
The Brexit minister is planning to sell off £1.5 billion worth of government offices in central London. Jacob Rees-Mogg told the Sunday Telegraph taxpayers shouldn't have to pay for buildings that are underutilised, with many civil servants still working from home. He's due to publish a property strategy that will see staff operating in fewer buildings as part of a network of government hubs. More than 25,000 migrants have now crossed the Channel so far this year. That's after 915 people were intercepted just yesterday. The Ministry of Defence saying they were on board 19 small boats. Monday saw the highest daily total on record, with 1,295 people making the treacherous journey from France. A new scheme's being launched to promote the next generation of UK artists on a global scale. The government art collection is behind the project, known as X-UK, to showcase British creativity. An exhibition of works will be displayed across embassies and government buildings around the world. That's it. You're up to date on GB News. More news as it happens. Now back to the political correction.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News, and this is the political correction. I'm Gianna Davison, and today I'm joined here in the studio by our very own Paul Embry. And joining us very shortly down the line is Arlene Foster in Northern Ireland. We're here, as always, for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. This is not about journalists talking to journalists, it's about you telling us what you think. Coming up this hour, we'll be talking about the newly announced energy price cap, which has been raised by 80%, as Chancellor Nadine Zahawi warns that households must try and reduce their energy consumption. This week, former Newsnight host Emily Maitlis hit out at the BBC, saying a rebuke she received from bosses for on-air remarks made in 2020 made no sense. She also alluded to Tory cronyism being at the heart of the company. Well, we'll be discussing those comments further. And as over 100,000 postal workers go on strike, we'll be joined by the Deputy General Secretary of the Communication Workers Union. And as you know, we want to hear from you on the political correction, so if you want to get involved in our conversation and have your message read out on the show, then email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is the political correction. Economists have warned that Britain is facing a year of double-digit inflation as energy bills continue to soar. On Friday, Ofgem announced that the energy price cap would rise from £1,971 to £3,549 a year from October the 1st, which is an 80% rise on the current cap, a cap which limits the amount that can be charged per unit of gas and electricity. So, Paul, I'm going to start with you here on this news, which was surely pretty shocking and depressing for millions who were already really worried about cost of living.
I think it's a national emergency, Deanna. I think millions of families risk being crippled by the increase in the cap, businesses as well. And I am concerned that the government has not got a grip of it. It's going to be very difficult, I think, for families to get through this winter. We're talking about bills potentially rising to an average of £3,500 after October. For millions of families, that is simply not going to be sustainable. And I think they are going to find themselves in a position between choosing whether to eat or whether to heat their homes. That's certainly going to be the situation facing, I think, many people. And we need to re-examine the elephant in the room, which is the whole question of energy independence. Mm-hmm. The fact that we do not have energy independence in this country is a national scandal. The fact that we have closed down so many of our coal-fired power stations too early, in my view. The fact that we have not got to grips with fracking and explored the potential for fracking, the fact that we were far too slow off the mark in terms of nuclear energy and are now paying a very, very heavy price for that. How can it be that a country, an advanced industrial country like Britain, does not have energy security, does not have energy independence? And I look at the fact that over the last couple of years, for example, we've seen energy ministers literally having PR photo shoots at coal-fired power stations saying, isn't it great that we are closing these stations down? Look, this station is being decommissioned to meet the green agenda. Well, fine. We all support the green agenda in principle, but if it means you find yourself a couple of years later in a situation where you are begging energy companies to keep supply going. I mean, there was a story recently about Kwasi Kwarteng effectively begging a particular energy company to keep its generators going. Then you've gone seriously wrong. So we need to have the debate in the short term about the impacts on families, the impacts on businesses, what we can do to alleviate that. But we need a much wider debate about how we ended up in the position where we are and what we're going to do about it in terms of energy security going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know we've discussed energy security quite a lot on our show over the past kind of year since we started. One of the things that I want to just touch on, though, is some of the support that is available, because I think people are really, really worried, and actually a lot of people aren't actually aware of some of the support that is going to be coming their way. So I just want to run through. For pensioners who get a winter fuel payment, there'll be an additional £300 paid to them this winter when they get that winter fuel payment. For those with registered disabilities, an additional £150 cost of living payment, as well as a £650 cost of living payment for some of those who are on the lowest incomes. And that is as well as a £400 energy discount for every household, which I think from October it'll be about £66 a month taken off people's direct debit bills every month until March. So there is some support in place in the short term. It sounds as though both of those leadership contenders, be it Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak, are willing to go further. But as you rightly said, Paul, that's the short-term stuff in terms of this winter. But Arlene, I want to come to you about the longer term, and that is, again, about energy security.
Well, yeah, and I just want to pick up on Paul's point, because when you're energy minister, there's three things that you have to consider. There's the security of supply, there's the cost of energy to consumers, and then there's the mix. And unfortunately, because of politics and because of pressure, we have allowed ourselves to look more at the mix. In other words, moving away from fossil fuels towards green energy. And we haven't taken into consideration the cost to consumers that will bring, and the impact on security of supply. Because I was just looking this morning, Deanna, at where we were getting energy from in GB this morning, and only 5% of our energy today comes from wind. The rest comes from gas-fired electricity plants, so that 60% is coming from that. And I mean, we have to ask ourselves, have we got ourselves into a situation because of the war in Ukraine, which is undoubtedly having an impact on the cost of wholesale gas and wholesale energy? But we should have had, if you like, a safety net in case some of these global events happened. But instead, we've been quite complacent in relation to our security of supply. And we find ourselves now in a position where we have this huge spike in the cost of energy, and some people individually are not going to be able to cope with it. And whilst there is a cap on domestic users, there's no cap for our small business users, and some businesses are going to go out of business. And after having to deal with COVID, which was a huge challenge to many businesses, as we know, because they had to close down and they were relying on government intervention, now they're in a situation that they're going to be faced with these huge energy bills, and government are going to have to intervene. I'm not a big interventionist, as you well know, Deanna, but they are going to have to intervene to help people through this short term. But in the medium to longer term, they're really going to have to sit back and look at the security of supply piece. And that means having a look again at net zero. I know it's something that people don't want to talk about, but we have to be sensible about this. Of course, we want to transition to more renewable sources of energy, but there has to be a transition. You can't just switch off things and then not expect there to be an impact.
Quite right. I think one of the interesting points on that in terms of transition as well is this move towards electric vehicles. There was a report out earlier this week saying that actually Electric vehicles have always been pitched as this thing that's going to be much cheaper to run than a petrol car, and actually, given the way that energy prices are going, that's completely not going to be the case. Another point about transition and why we need to be much more savvy. But to tell us a little bit more about the energy price cap, here is GB News presenter and economist Liam Halligan.
The government says it's working flat out to develop options to help cash-strapped households after this weekend's announcement of Ofgem's new energy price cap. Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi acknowledges that Friday's news of an 80% rise in average household energy bills from October will cause stress and anxiety for many people. But he puts the blame elsewhere.
Putin will continue to use energy as a weapon, as a way of getting back at us for the help we're putting into Ukraine. We need to remain resilient. We need to make sure that this isn't a sticking plaster, that for the long term we continue to help the most vulnerable who have no cushion, and that's what I'm determined to do, and we're working up those options for both households and for business for the incoming Prime Minister on the 5th September.
6 months of war in Ukraine have indeed pushed up wholesale gas prices as Russia's restricted supplies to countries assisting Kiev. As the Kremlin's turned the screw, Western European nations have been stockpiling gas ahead of winter, pushing up prices even more. Regulator Ofgem caps what energy companies can charge households for gas and electricity. Until last October, that cap was around £1,200 a year. In April, it rose to almost £2,000, but has now soared to over £3,500. So average household fuel bills from October will be almost 3 times higher than a year ago. Back in May, ministers announced all households will receive a £400 annual rebate on their energy bills. And certain more vulnerable families already on benefits may qualify for another £650 of targeted assistance. But the government faces criticism that since Boris Johnson resigned as Tory leader in July, the ongoing race to succeed him has been a diversion. Energy campaigners have told me a far more comprehensive support package should already have been in place, ahead of this higher Ofgem price cap.
We haven't got a new government. It's the same party. That really, it is absolutely shocking. It's a dereliction of duty to have sat on your hands and to watch this come kind of crashing towards us. I think, look, the urgent issue is to provide immediate support to people on the lowest income. That could be doubling the package that we had in May from then Chancellor Sunak to match the new reality. It could be even more than that. I think that's a no-brainer.
As summer ends, we face an autumn and winter of sky-high utility bills. Ministers will unveil more help, but only once a fresh Prime Minister emerges and a new government's formed after September the 5th. Any assistance package, though, will only partially ease, rather than fully offset, the pain of spiralling energy costs on cash-strapped households and the broader economy.
Well, there was Liam Halligan with a rundown of the latest on the energy price cap. Now, Labour are at odds with independent fact-checking charity Full Fact after it claimed the party's energy price cap freeze was underfunded by at least £5 billion. Labour responded by saying that the charity did not understand how direct debit works. So Keir Starmer said his party have a fully costed, comprehensive plan, which will be welcome news to so many people who are currently worried sick. So, Arlene, do you think that Labour's answer of a freeze on energy prices is the right answer? Do you think that's the right approach to the energy crisis?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that it's never a good thing to challenge a charity that spends its time looking at these sorts of things in great detail. But in any event, I do think that Keir Starmer, after he came back from his holiday, did capture the mood and rightly concentrated on energy costs and what they could do to deal with these issues, because I think the Tory leadership election contest has dragged on for a long period of time. We're not hearing anything new from those hustings, Deanna. We hear the same speech every single time. We're hearing the same issues being dealt with internally in the Conservative Party, and that's fine. But at the same time, it has allowed Labour to come forward with this package, and whatever about the cost of it and whatever about how it works, it does look as if they are taking the initiative in dealing with the energy costs. And when you're in opposition, you can do that sort of thing. And certainly they have come forward at least with a policy, whatever about the costings of it. But for me, freezing the price of energy, and it goes back to our previous discussion, is only really a stopgap. We have to grapple with the real issues and look at why this has happened. What are the policies decision that has led us to here? Of course, there's been the intervention of the war in Ukraine, and that's going to have impacts as well. Not to go off on a tangent, but I spoke to a former president of Ukraine on Friday. I asked him, did he think that the support for war in Ukraine might go down in the UK because of the energy crisis? And he acknowledged that it was a real issue, the energy crisis. And that goes back to the comments from Nadhim Zahawi that Putin is using energy as a tool in this war, and he knows that it will have a real impact in the West. And that goes back to the fact that we're not energy independent, because we're relying on other people who can then switch on and off the gas pipelines, and that has a real impact on the citizens here in the UK. So there has to be a complete rethink of energy policy, whoever is in number 10, and I hope that it will be the number one priority when they get in there.
Paul, I want to come to you on Labour's plan on this sort of price cap freeze. Do you think that it's actually kind of doable, or do you worry that it might put yet more energy suppliers out of business and actually exacerbate the problem?
I think it's all right as a stopgap, as Arlene said. I believe that freezing it is right. I think taxing the excess profits of the energy companies is the right thing to do as well. But in the long term, Deanna, I mean, I would call for the whole of energy policy to be brought into public ownership. I mean, I believe that there are some things that are so critical to the functioning of the country, to the success and the prosperity of the country, and for the country basically to run itself day to day, that they shouldn't be handed over to the market, and they shouldn't be subject to the daily diktats of the market. I mean, I think there are some things that the market does very well. If I want to book a holiday, I'll go to the free market. If I want to buy a new suit or eat in a restaurant, I'll go to the free market. If it comes to energy supply and heating my home and being able to make sure that the lights stay on, then actually I don't think that should be the responsibility of the market. I think that should be the responsibility of elected governments. Now, of course, Keir Starmer, when he was standing for the Labour leadership, gave a commitment to take energy into public ownership. He appears to have resiled from that in the couple of years since, which I don't think is particularly wise, and I don't think is good for the country. So,
as a Labour member, how does that make you feel? Because it's quite a pivotal position, isn't it?
Yeah, and I don't think he's given any justification for it really, apart from cost. But he would have known that it would have cost money to nationalise energy back when he made the commitment. I suspect he was playing to very much what was at the time quite a Corbynite party, and thought that in order to win the leadership, he had to make those kind of radical promises, even if he didn't particularly believe in them. But that aside, I think as a matter of principle, it's actually the right policy. As I said at the top of the show, how can it be that in an advanced industrial country like Britain, we don't have energy independence and we're subject to as I say, the caprices and the diktats of the market? And, some of these oil and gas companies are posting record profits, the likes of BP and Shell and British Gas and so on. And I know they have argued that, well, a lot of those profits are not necessarily coming directly from household bills. But the reality is, think about how that plays out politically in the country. People are thinking, I'm struggling to make ends meet. I'm being hit with these incredibly high energy bills. How am I going to be able to pay the mortgage and put food on the table at the end of the month? They're not going to be won over by multi-billion pounds corporations who are posting record profits saying, oh, but by the way, a lot of that isn't coming from your energy bill. So we need a proper debate, basically, about what I think has become profiteering on the part of the energy companies, and we need a proper debate about public ownership and securing energy supply going forward in this country.
I was getting a bit worried. We got almost 20 minutes in, you hadn't actually mentioned nationalisation. So,
well, there you go.
I knew it had to come eventually. Arlene, it is a pretty reasonable point, though, isn't it, that actually when it comes to energy, The energy firms aren't making a great deal of profit, are they? We were talking about the breakdown just before we came on air.
Yeah, so the household bill, if you look at that 3,549 figure that has been posted for the cap, they get £63 of profit from that. So I think the point is they're not getting their huge profits that Paul's talking about from household bills, certainly not. And the question, I suppose, then is, should they be using some of those profits to help with the cost of household bills and bills to small businesses? Let's remember those small businesses are going to be under huge pressures. And frankly, that may be a regulation issue. Can they use money from another part of their business to offset the huge price spikes for householders and for small businesses? I don't know the answer to that. That might be a regulatory issue. But let's look at all of those issues. Let's see what we can do to help people in the short term. But in the longer term, we are definitely going to have to look at, yes, we want to get to net zero, but we have to transition in a sensible way so that we don't put people into poverty and we don't put people out of business. That's what we really need to look at.
Absolutely. Well, a certain degree of kind of cross-party unity here on the political correction this morning. But send us your thoughts from home. What do you make of the latest price cap announcement from Ofgem? What do you make of what the different parties and indeed Conservative leadership candidates are saying? Get in touch, gbviews@gbnews.uk. But coming up after the break, we'll be discussing the BBC and comments made this week by former Newsnight host Emily Maitlis. But we want to hear from you. As I said, get in touch, gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. See you in a few moments.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the political correction. Former Newsnight host Emily Maitlis has hit out at the BBC, saying a rebuke she received from bosses for on-air remarks made in 2020 made no sense. She also alluded to cronyism at the heart of the broadcasting company. Maitlis was accused twice of showing bias against the Boris Johnson government. First, when she discussed the now infamous Dominic Cummings' Barnard Castle trip, and second, after a Piers Morgan retweet where he questioned the government's pandemic response. Let's take a listen to her Dominic Cummings monologue now.
Good evening. Dominic Cummings broke the rules. The country can see that, and it shocked the government cannot. The longer ministers and Prime Minister tell us he worked within them, the more angry the response to this scandal is likely to be. He was the man, remember, who always got the public mood, who tagged the lazy label of elite on those who disagreed. He should understand that public mood now, one of fury, contempt and anguish. He made those who struggle to keep to the rules feel like fools and has allowed many more to assume they can now flout them. The Prime Minister knows all this, but despite the resignation of one minister, growing unease from his backbenchers, a dramatic early warning from the polls and a deep national disquiet, Boris Johnson has chosen to ignore it. Tonight we consider what this blind loyalty tells us about the workings of Number 10. We do not expect to be joined by a government minister, but that won't stop us asking the question.
Well, during a speech last week, Maitlis asked whether the BBC had been purposefully sending a message of reassurance to Downing Street. Paul, what do you make of this story? Is there conservative cronyism at the heart of the BBC?
Well, I'm on the left, Deanna, but I struggle to agree with Emily Maitlis on this. I've got to be honest. I mean, I've been inside the BBC, I've walked down its corridors, I've met its people. And the truth is, look, it is pretty much stuffed full of people with a kind of left-leaning, liberal, cosmopolitan, Remain voting, middle-class, progressive bias. That's the reality of it. And I think that the idea that because every now and then a token right-winger, if you like, is appointed, that the likes of Emily Maitlis then throw their hands up and say, oh, this is an example of how the BBC is in hock to the Conservative Party. No, I'm not buying it, to be perfectly blunt. I think the truth is that cohort of people who I described, who the BBC is chock full of, the reality is I don't think they've ever really reconciled themselves to Brexit. They think Brexit was a result of disinformation, of corruption, of the Russians and all this kind of thing. And they've got it into their heads that actually the BBC has kind of fallen victim to that and has now been captured by the forces of the right, the forces of Brexit and so on and so forth. But it's just not true. I mean, it's simply not true. They can't get over the fact that having had it their way for so long, the likes of Emily Maitlis and those people on the Liberal side of politics, the last few years they haven't had it their own way and they're looking for all kind of sinister reasons for it, rather than the fact that their view of society really was just out of kilter with the view of society that millions of people held in this country. So no, I think the comments are a nonsense, quite frankly.
So not very strong views there from Paul. Arlene, what about you? What do you make of it?
Well, I mean, it's laughable, isn't it, to think that there's some sort of Tory agenda going on in the BBC. Certainly not impacting on their output, to put it politely anyway. I mean, there probably is cronyism in the BBC, but it's certainly not a Tory cronyism. It's something, and Paul has already described sort of people that are there. I think it's quite concerning, though, that some very senior Labour people have praised Emily Maitlis for what she had to say about the BBC, and I find that disconcerting because you have people like David Dimbleby now questioning what she has to say. And I mean, David Dimbleby is not known to be a right-wing Tory, and he's basically saying if instead of delivering a monologue, she had asked those questions, it could have been dealt with differently. But she stated those things as a fact, and that is why she was challenged editorially by the BBC bosses, and she found that difficult to take. I mean, we all long for the days of Lord Reith when we actually had a BBC which considered all viewpoints and considered them in a valid way. So I think Emily Maitlis is trying to justify her time in the BBC. She's now came out of the BBC. She's starting her own podcast with Global. According to the Daily Mail today, cabinet ministers will not be taking part in her podcast because of what she's had to say. I mean, she certainly is very partisan. She's entitled to be partisan. But the question is, was she impartial when she was at the BBC? When a couple of days after she left the BBC, she very clearly showed that she was not impartial. So, I mean, this is the thing. The BBC needs to take a long look at itself. We were told that was going to happen. It hasn't happened, and it still continues.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because when Tim Davies sort of came in, we were told there was going to be kind of fundamental changes. But, Paul, we haven't actually really seen any evidence of follow-through on that, have we?
No, not particularly. And going back to what Arlene said about David Dimbleby, we could also cite Andrew Marr, who, you know, was a BBC man to his bones, but some years ago gave an interview in which he said that the BBC unquestionably had a culturally liberal bias. So if people like Mara saying that, you can guess there's some accuracy to it. And I think there were some figures released over the last couple of days where it showed that the 10 people who had made the most appearances on Question Time all voted Remain. So it was people like Ken Clarke and others. Now, bearing in mind 52% of the country voted Leave, and yet the top 10 people who appeared on Question Time were literally all Remain voters. Look, the idea that the BBC is in the pocket of the right wing and some sort of Tory agenda, I just don't think stands up to scrutiny. I'd like to be able to agree with Emily Maitlis politically, but it's just not true, and we have to be honest about that.
Well, send us your views from home. What do you make of Emily Maitlis's comments? What do you make about accusations that the BBC is in the pocket of the Conservative Party? Let us know, gbviews@gbnews.uk. We want to hear from you. Now, over 100,000 Royal Mail postal workers have walked out on strike in a dispute over pay, in the first of 4 days of industrial action, with walkouts also due to take place on the 31st of August and the 8th and 9th of September. The Communication Workers Union, who represent those striking, are demanding a pay rise that more closely reflects the current rate of inflation. And the Royal Mail has said the union had rejected a pay rise offer worth up to 5.5% after months of negotiations. Well, to discuss the walkout further, we're now joined by the Deputy General Secretary of the CWU, Terry Pullinger. Terry, just talk to us first about the reasons for the strike, because often it's reported as just being about pay. Is it that simple, or is there more at stake here?
There will be more at stake, because there's actually 2 disputes. There's one on pay, and there's also one on unacceptable changes that we believe will be not just damaging to our members, but hugely damaging to this magnificent public service. Interesting, I was listening to some of your earlier stuff you was talking about utilities, etc. Well, we're in a similar situation. On the issue of pay, this has been going on. We wrote to the company in February. We could see the cost of living crisis coming towards us. Obviously, our members had been magnificent during the pandemic. There'd been a £1 billion turnaround in the company's fortunes, and we wanted a quick no-strings pay deal to help them cope with the cost of living crisis, but also wrote at the same time about continuing to deploy our change agreement that was only just over a year old and which had been going very well. And the company disengaged. They didn't come back to us till April. And then suddenly we were confronted with totally unacceptable change and a pay offer which was conditional on them unacceptable changes. And it's continued since. So we haven't just, this isn't knee-jerk action. This has been going on all year, these discussions. And we've reached a point where there's absolutely no movement and no choice but for us to, protest in the only way we can to try and get some decent negotiations.
I'm going to bring in Paul Embry now.
Terry, I should declare an interest. My brother is a postman and a proud CWU member and supports the strike 100%. Terry, you'll be aware that some companies who are facing wage demands at the moment are using the argument, look, our costs have been hit too. We're suffering from the cost of living crisis. We're not able to pay the wage demands that you're tabling. Is that an argument that Royal Mail could legitimately make?
Well, they're making arguments now about losing £1 million a day, and but everybody knows it's about creative accountancy. Figures lie, liars figure. That really needs to. What we got to understand. So the only measure we can have as ordinary, decent working people is since July 2021, circa £700 million has gone to shareholders. Senior managers have had pay rises, they've had huge bonuses. The CEO got a £140,000 bonus as an example. Some got even more than that. And yet there's no money for the people that did all the work over the last 18 months. So if there's no money, why has all this money been paid out? Why is it, ordinary people can't understand that sort of behaviour. And, we deserve a decent pay rise. We provide a magnificent public service. I think the deeper dive for everyone, interestingly, businesses and unions have their spats and people just get the headlines. But we've got a thing called the universal service. And that universal service is a six-day delivery. Uniform price goes everywhere. So the people that are more geographically, financially or digitally isolated get that service. It's been an invention. It's over 500 years old. It continues to prove its worth during times of adversity, and especially during the pandemic it did. But this is the privatisation. All of a sudden there's this shift, and basically we are very concerned that this is about a break-up of the company, that great public service will gradually get ruined, that the company's only interested in profitable parcels, wants to reduce its workforce. There's some real huge things at stake. So yes, it started off on pay, and that's what we're taking strike action on now, but we have got a massive mandate on change as well. So there will be more industrial action if those proposals don't change. I'd just ask people to understand this. So we are a democratic organisation. We balloted our members. In excess of 86,000 people voted, and we had 2 yes votes. One was 97.6%, one was 98.7%, 1.3% short of 100% of people voting with their union, despite the company spending fortunes on propaganda. So your postal worker, you just said your brother's one. These are decent people. They don't vote like that unless there's something seriously wrong in the organisation that they work for. And I'd ask people just to bear that in mind.
And Tory, can you just clarify for our viewers and listeners, is the union's position, look, we don't want any change at all. We don't want any negotiations. We're not prepared to entertain any talks over changes? Or is the position, look, give us a pay increase for what we're doing now, and then if you want to have a further discussion about changes, then we're happy to get into that?
No, I welcome your point. I mean, you would know from your brother, but obviously the viewers don't all know. We constantly embrace change. Everyone knows their postal services have changed over the years. We used to do 2 deliveries. We used to be out on the street at 6:30 in the morning. Now it's 1 delivery, etc. Now we deliver later in the day. We got people who work 7 days. The narrative is nonsense. It just suits their position to paint the union that way. At the end of 2020, the start of 2021. The company was predicting losses of between £500 and £600 million. We made an agreement called the Pathway to Change Agreement, mutual interest agreement, taking things forward. We deployed that during the pandemic, revision activity. We deployed more change than we've ever done in that period of time in our history. We deployed more automation than we've done at any time in our history in that short period of time. The company was praising us in their financial reports because it was £1 billion turnaround. Then all overnight, every postal worker has grown 2 heads and won't accept change. It's just absolute nonsense. Our history is riddled with the changes and the way we want to reinvent Royal Mail. We had a policy forum in March when the company had disengaged of how we continue to take this Pathway to Change agreement forward, working 7 days, etc. More people doing 3 and 4 day weeks, covering 7 days, lots of things. A 91-page document of ideas of new products and services that build upon the USO but protect it. So build upon that universal service, which is enshrined in statute, by the way. So only the government can change that. And when it was privatised, these people had a responsibility to look after it. We were privatised as a group. We've got a European international parcel company called GLS. They've now totally detached any cross-subsidy and they're looking at selling that off. This is a corporate raid. Please, I ask everyone, just really give some due consideration here because we will see the end of this great postal service as we know it. And I think the United Kingdom will be less because of that. And people who live in them outlying areas. Next Wednesday, I'm going to Northern Ireland next Wednesday, actually. I'm going to speak to members over in there in Northern Ireland because I know, I've heard the company. Things like delivering to Northern Ireland are extremely costly. That's why you need a universal service. Otherwise, the prices would go through the roof for people in Northern Ireland, for people in Cornwall, for any outlying areas, Scotland, Wales, etc. It can't all be about city centres, and that's why this great public service needs protecting. There's enough researchers, there's enough intelligence out there. People should see this for what it is and really think about why would postal workers, the people you know by name that have served you well, that you applauded and were leaving presents out in the streets for our members and everything else during the pandemic, why would they suddenly turn into these strange people that want to bring down society? It's absolute nonsense. This is a genuine dispute. We're not just fighting for ourselves here. We're fighting for this great public service, which is still relevant and over 500 years old. And this The United Kingdom should be so proud of this postal service and do everything they can to protect it. We are reasonable people. We've made endless agreements. Of course, now that we've got 2 disputes, we understand they may well be resolved, but they'll have to be resolved simultaneously now. But as it goes forward, we are actually seeing what's going on with this postal service. And there's huge rumours out there at the moment about a massive takeover from shareholders. We've been in talks with management who have told us the rules of this company's existence now is to serve shareholders. Our members are at the bottom of the list, closely followed by the public. Please wake up and understand this is a genuine dispute and one we are extremely serious about.
Well, Terry Pullinger there joining us from the Communication Workers Union with a call to arms about why we should be supporting the Royal Mail workers. Terry, thank you for your time with us this morning. Paul, I just want to come to you because, you know, we are seeing an awful lot of strikes taking place over this summer. And, of course, there were the Mick Lynch comments earlier on this week about how, you know, the entire union movement should come together to redress the balance in society. Now, it strikes me that the kind of Mick Lynch approach and that sort of more politicised union movement isn't reflective of what it is that the CWU are looking for there, is it, in terms of actually supporting their members?
I think there's a broad consensus that the economy is fundamentally unfair. I think most trade unionists would believe that. I think there's a broad consensus that what we're seeing is a transfer of power and wealth from the poor to the rich. And that, I think, has exacerbated throughout the pandemic and now as a part of the cost of living crisis. And that, frankly, we need a new economic model. We need a new economic model that doesn't create such huge disparities in wealth between rich and poor, that doesn't just invest everything in financial services and ignore the real economy, ignore the public sector, ignore the productive sector, and has things like closing the gap between rich and poor, tackling regional inequalities, tackling boardroom excesses, increasing the minimum wage, that kind of thing. I think there's huge support out there for that, actually. And what I've been struck by, Deanna, is sometimes you would think that much of the public would be really, really critical of people taking strike action, particularly in essential services. But in my experience over recent weeks, there's been quite a bit of sympathy. You know, with the RMT strike, for example, you see passengers pop up and being interviewed on TV and on the radio who say, look, yes, it is an inconvenience, it's a pain in the backside, but I do understand why they're doing it. And the government ignores that sentiment at its peril. I think support for what's happening at the moment is much wider than some people seem to realise.
Well, let's hear from our viewers. What do you make of the strike action from the Royal Mail, but also from some of the other trade unions, particularly, as Paul's just mentioned there, the RMT? Have you been affected by strike action? Are you concerned about more? Send us your views on gbviews@gbnews.uk. But coming up after the break, we'll be talking about channel crossings and reports from Border Force officers that the majority of those currently making the perilous journeys are from Albania. Don't go anywhere.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the show. As always, loads of you have been getting in touch. Thank you for doing so. We start off with a little bit about the Conservative leadership. We've got Julie, who says, do we really want a Prime Minister who will waltz off in a huff if he fails to get the job? He's spoken about the joy of serving, but it seems to be all over if he doesn't get what he wants. I assume that's about Rishi Sunak. Paul?
Yeah, that's interesting, actually, because there's been talk of him possibly disappearing to California because he's obviously got a history with America and stuff. Do you think he's likely to pop off, Deanna?
I have no idea. I mean, certainly that's not what he's saying. He's saying that obviously he'd continue to stay and do his part. I guess the proof will be in seeing what he does next and obviously seeing what the result is because, whilst the polls are the polls, we still don't know until the 5th of September.
And it wouldn't look great, would it? If you aspire to be the Prime Minister of the country, you're going for the leadership contest, you lose, and then you slide off to America. I'm not saying he is going to do that, but I don't think it would be well received.
Optically, not a good look.
No, exactly. On cost of living, Alan says that many pensioners will reach net zero very soon. In our bank accounts. I think that's a real issue, isn't it? The impact on pensioners.
Absolutely. And Arlene, have you got some views for us as well? Oh, I'll do another one quickly before we bring Arlene back. We've got Ray in Tonbridge who says, I sent an email to my MP asking for Parliament to stand up and apologise to the country for the inept way governments of all colours over the last 40 years have managed our energy security. Well, again, coming back to this point that we've said about energy security and how really it does need to be a focus of energy policy moving forward. Sorry, Arlene, over to you now.
Yeah, sure. So Joan is saying abolish MPs' expenses in the House of Lords. Taxpayers should not be paying energy bills for MPs' second homes. This scandal has to stop. And then John is saying it's gone beyond heat or eat. People will go to bed both cold and hungry this autumn and winter. I think people are now getting very alarmed. We're talking a lot about cost of living crisis, and that has an impact then on how people are looking to the winter time. And people are getting quite anxious about this, Deanna, and that's something we have to watch for as well.
And you mentioned the point, Deanna, off camera, actually, that there's not a lot of focus on businesses, the impacts on businesses at the moment. I mean, we've obviously talked about the impact on individuals and households and stuff, but actually, I mean, I've seen tweets from businesses, for example, who have posted screenshots of their predicted energy bills.
Staggering,
Some of them are eye-watering, and you think, actually, this is potentially... Bearing in mind we're on the brink of a recession as well, I mean, this is a real double whammy that could see lots of bankruptcies and people being laid off. You're then into that downward spiral, which is then difficult to recover from, isn't it?
Yeah, huge issue for businesses. And it was actually reassuring hearing the clip earlier, if you were tuned in, from Nadeem Zahawi saying that some of the packages that they're working up as options for the incoming Prime Minister does include potential support for businesses as well. But clearly we need to see that as quickly as we can, because as Paul said, I mean, some of these small hospitality businesses in particular seeing 5 times increases in their energy bills. And that's not it going from kind of 500 quid to 2.5 grand. That's it going from 10 grand to 50 grand or 60 grand in some cases. I don't want to see people getting laid off because of this. So clearly that support needs to be put in place. So here is a call to arms from all of us that whoever becomes Prime Minister, whoever becomes Chancellor, needs to look at that business support as well. Well, let's move on. Let's talk about channel crossings, because this morning we learned that the number of people arriving in the UK on small boats has passed the 25,000 mark after another 915 crossed yesterday. It's also been revealed that 60% of those arriving in the UK are from Albania. Last Monday, more than 700 out of the record total of almost 1,300 migrants were from the southeastern European country. Well, our GB News Home and Security editor, Mark White, has more.
Arriving into Dover Harbour, the Border Force vessel Ranger, her decks packed with Channel migrants, most likely to be from Albania. In fact, we can confirm that 60% of those currently arriving into UK waters on small boats are from that tiny nation. In truth, this is a crisis within a crisis, which has so concerned UK authorities, It resulted in what amounts to an emergency agreement between the UK and Albanian governments to rapidly remove those with no right to asylum. The British government believes that's likely to be the vast majority of those arriving from what is a peaceful nation on the Balkan Peninsula. We've been told that 6 in 10 of those arriving on small boats at the moment are from Albania, more than 6,000 already this year and growing rapidly. Compare that to just 2 years ago, when only 50 Albanians arrived by small boat. Here in the Albanian capital, Tirana, this is also an existential crisis for those in government here, as the country faces rapid depopulation. Since the 90s, the population has fallen by more than 15% and now numbers fewer than 2.8 million people. The crisis is most acute in Albania's rural towns and villages, where the vast majority of their young have up sticks and left. In fact, Albania is one of the few nations in the world where there are more of its people living outside than inside the country. As part of the agreement with the UK, Albanian law enforcement officials will be seconded here to the Border Force processing centres at Dover Harbour and the former RAF base at Manston. We're told they'll help gather intelligence on arrivals and quickly assess those with no right to be here. Officials hope those individuals could be removed within 2 or 3 weeks of arriving. However, there's little doubt asylum lawyers will try to challenge those decisions. Nothing surrounding this growing crisis is ever straightforward. Mark White, GB News.
Well, there we heard a little bit more about the current migrant crisis that we're facing. Paul, I want you to cast your mind back. So I remember when we first started doing the political correction, we were having a lot of conversations about the migrant crossings back when Nigel Farage was sitting right next to me on this sofa. And I remember saying to him, you know, the Home Secretary is doing work on this. We're trying to get more removals arrangements in place. We've got on with Albania. And I remember he laughed and was like, oh, what, you know, Albania, kind of like, what good's that? But actually, surely now we can see the good from that, because if it is the case indeed that an awful lot of the people coming over here are Albanian, if any of those prove to be failed asylum seekers, we do now have an arrangement where they can be sent back to their home country. This is a really good thing, isn't it?
I'm sceptical. My jury's out. The truth is, Deanna, will it happen? I mean, we've had all sorts of promises from the Tory government going back many years about how they're going to get to grips with illegal immigration, and frankly, they just haven't dealt with it. And I think people are right to be sceptical about whether they will deal with it now. I mean, more broadly, I think this is the type of thing, really, that just breaks people's faith in the system. I think we are a tolerant nation, we are an open nation. I think that people, by and large, in this country are open to the idea of welcoming refugees who are genuinely fleeing persecution, as well as a certain number of economic migrants as well. What they don't want is a situation where thousands of people every month are turning up on our shores undocumented, mainly young men in this case. There seems to be very few women and children coming across the channel. And we, you know, as we've learned, as Mark told us, many of them from Albania, which is a relatively peaceful and safe country. And I think the question that many people ask is, look, why are people leaving a civilised country such as Spain, having come from a peaceful country such as Albania, and then turning up on our shores undocumented? We're being asked to believe by partisans in the debate and political campaigners these are all refugees fleeing persecution. The truth is they're not, and we have to have an honest and hard-headed debate about that. But let's see what the government does. I'm not particularly hopeful, to be blunt.
So, Arlene, we heard in that piece there from Mark White that there's going to be, you know, Albanian law enforcement brought into place to work alongside Border Force, and potentially failed asylum seekers could be removed in as quickly as 2 to 3 weeks. Do you think that's likely to happen in a lot of cases, or do you think we're going to keep facing these kind of legal challenges last minute to stop people actually getting on the planes?
Well, it's our system. We have a very good democratic system, but unfortunately, it's now being used in a lawfare type of way to, as Paul rightly says, these are people who are not refugees. They are not even economic migrants. They're people who are coming across because they think they might have a better time in the UK from the country that they're currently in. And I think Mark confirmed earlier on today that we've now over 25,000 this year alone that have come over in these small boats. That is a huge impact on services here in the UK. And, you know, when we talk about waiting lists in the NHS and we talk about not being able to get to see a GP or a dentist, we have to factor that in to the equation, because we are having these people coming in to our country. They are undocumented. We try to put them back to their own country through legal methods, not putting them into a dangerous situation, putting them back to their own country. And yet lawfare is used by people to stop all of that. And it must be so frustrating for the government. I do feel for Priti Patel. She has tried, although many times in vain, to deal with this issue. And I think government's going to have again a radical rethink, given the number of people that are coming over in these small boats.
I think it's such a shame for kind of people who are coming here through legal channels, genuine, you know, people fleeing persecution, genuine refugees. I think that it kind of adds to this sort of, I don't quite want to say distrust, but everyone kind of gets kind of tarred with the same brush when there's so many people coming here through illegal means. I think it's kind of such a shame. Paul, I saw you nod there.
Yeah, and what I think is sad is that the effects of that is that the whole issue of immigration has become toxic again. It's become a running sore in our political discourse, and I think that's really sad because, you know, we've moved on from the days of the 1970s when the National Front were on the march and marching through areas with large numbers of ethnic minority people and harassing them and abusing them and telling them that they didn't belong here. We've moved on from that, and unfortunately, this debate has now taken us back to that poisonous kind of atmosphere, and I think that's sad. It's why we need to get to grips with it.
Yeah, well, send us your thoughts. What do you make of the latest on the Channel crossings? But that is it for our first hour here on The Political Correction. But plenty more to come after this short break, so don't go anywhere.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GBNews.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning and welcome back to The Political Correction. Coming up this hour of the show, we'll be talking about the upcoming final leadership hustings taking place in London this week, as well as comments from Rishi Sunak that too much power was given to scientists during COVID lockdowns. That plus plenty more after your latest news with Polly.
Good morning. Just after 11 o'clock, I'm Polly Middlehurst in the GB newsroom. A huge package of financial support has been promised by the government to help struggling households through the energy crisis. The Prime Minister has written an article in the Daily Mail where he acknowledged bills are going to be eye-watering and the next few months are going to be tough. He said colossal sums of taxpayers' money is already being used to help people, and his successor will announce more support next month. Well, the two Tory leadership candidates are yet to reveal exactly how they plan to ease the cost of living crisis. Rishi Sunak's team has criticised reports that Liz Truss plans to cut VAT by 5%, describing it as incredibly regressive. It's understood the Foreign Secretary has discussed a nuclear option with her advisers, which would reportedly save the average household more than £1,300 a year. Mr Sunak's campaign says the move would cost more than £30 billion. Meanwhile, Ms Truss has vowed to bolster Britain's defences if she becomes Prime Minister, saying the era of complacency is over. She wants to push ahead with renewing Trident and strengthen support for intelligence services as part of her plan to protect the UK. Retired British Army officer Major General Tim Cross told GB News, with Russia a continued threat, Britain needs to reconsider its defence and foreign policies.
Over these last 20 years, we have become complacent. We never really put sufficient resources in terms of military into Iraq or Afghanistan, and we weren't prepared to stay there for the length of time that we had been involved in, for example, the Cold War. So I think we have been complacent, and what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and indeed elsewhere, I mean, autocracies, dictatorships, China, and so on, has made people realise that we do need to think again about how we're going to engage in not just defence policy, but foreign policy and other aspects of our external relationships as well.
In other news, the Brexit minister is planning to sell off £1.5 billion worth of government offices in central London. Jacob Rees-Mogg told the Sunday Telegraph taxpayers shouldn't have to pay for buildings that are underutilised, with many civil servants still working from home. He's due to publish a property strategy that will see staff operating in fewer buildings as part of a network of government hubs. Well, as you've been hearing, more than 25,000 migrants have now crossed the English Channel so far this year. That's after 915 people were intercepted just yesterday, the Ministry of Defence saying they were on board 19 small boats. Monday saw the highest daily total on record, with 1,295 people making the treacherous journey from France. And a new scheme is being launched to promote the next generation of UK artists, this time on a global scale. The Government Art Collection, as it's called, will be behind the project known as X-UK to showcase British creativity. An exhibition of works will be displayed across embassies and government buildings around the world. And just lastly, two skyscrapers, nicknamed the Twin Towers, have been demolished in India. Take a look. Thousands of people had to be evacuated from their homes ahead of the implosion on the outskirts of New Delhi. The 40-storey buildings are the largest structures to be demolished in the country, destroyed because they violated building regulations. Police and emergency personnel were deployed for the operation. The skyscrapers coming down in just a matter of seconds, as you saw. You're with GB News, more news as it happens. Now let's get back to the political correction.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News, and this is the Political Correction. We're here for the next hour to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. Coming up this hour, we'll be looking ahead to the final leadership hustings taking place this week in London. We'll also be discussing comments made this week by Rishi Sunak that too much power was given to scientists during COVID lockdowns. And we'll be joined by Dr. Jonathan Romain for our regular Common Ground feature. But as you know, here on the Political Correction, we want to hear from you. So if you want to get involved in the conversation and have your message read out on air, then email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is the Political Correction. Well, thank you to all of you who have reached out today. We've got loads of your views coming in about all the things that we've been discussing today. But I just wanted to start with this nice one from Michael. Michael says, "Hi GB News. Prior to GB News, I'd watch This Week, Question Time, Daily Politics, Newsnight and the BBC News Channel. More often than not, my blood pressure would be through the roof and my telly was looking the worst for the knocks and chips it would receive from my disagreement. Thank God for GB News. As such, I've not watched the BBC for a full year, except for this month's leadership hustings. I'm better for it and my telly is no longer abused. Well, Michael, thank you for that really, really kind feedback and glad to have you as a regular viewer. Paul.
Flattery will get you everywhere, Michael. On the unions, Simon says all unions are trying to bring down the government. It's the only way Labour is going to get into power. I mean, I would say to Simon, actually, what we're seeing are a number of individual political disputes over, I beg your pardon, industrial disputes over the fact that people are not being paid enough. Every time someone takes strike action does not mean they're looking to bring down the government, but that is a charge that I think is often wrongly levelled at unions.
I think an interesting one there, though, from Derek around sort of strikes and pay rises. More and more workforces are striking or threatening to strike, demanding pay rises in line with inflation. They've been offered reasonable increases in the region of 7 to 9%, and even extra lump sums on top to help with the cost of living crisis. Can someone please raise a voice for the OAPs? We were given an increase of 3.2% when inflation was around 7.5%. We have no recourse to strike action. And I think that's sometimes, Paul, isn't it, why sometimes members of the public, people who work in the private sector, pensioners, aren't always on board with the strikes because they feel, well, why should they get it when we don't?
I certainly think pensioners have had a hard time and are often an easy target. I think there's this perception among some people that every pensioner is kind of living a nice middle-class life and has got quite a tidy income, thank you very much, and that the price is being paid only by the younger generation. Actually, there are many, many pensioners who are finding it really difficult to make ends meet at the moment and who are thinking about how they're going to heat their homes and so on. And yeah, we absolutely should give a nod to those people. Derek's right about that, I think.
Arlene?
Yeah, so going back to the strikes, we've one here from Parker who says about the postal workers, they should stay on strike because they're almost invisible in my postcode and most correspondence is conducted on the internet. Plus, I will not miss the pizza leaflets dropping on my doorstep. Well, let me say this, the universal services obligation, which the Deputy Secretary mentioned there, is so critical for those of us who live in rural areas. I mean, otherwise, the Postal Service would not deliver to places like where I live in County Fermanagh the same rate as they do in urban areas. So that universal service obligation is so critical for those of us who live in country areas. And I'm glad it's protected by legislation, and it hopefully will continue to be protected by legislation, because I certainly value the work that our postal service does, particularly, and we're talking about older people, for older people who still like to receive letters. I include myself in that category, I have to say. There's nothing like getting a letter or a postal communication from people, Christmas cards, etc. I can't stand e-Christmas cards. Can you imagine anything worse than an e-Christmas card? I mean, what is its purpose? It has no purpose.
I'd rather just get a WhatsApp.
I want a Christmas card. I'm just saying that there.
Arlene, did I detect, Arlene, a smidgen of sympathy for something said by a trade union leader on our show?
You did, and can I say to you, if you want me to develop that point, I do actually think that the postal workers have a point. I do, however, think that Mick Lynch saying that everybody should come out and strike is a political point, Paul. And let's be honest about that. It's not about industrial rights. It is actually a political point. If individual organisations have problems in relation to pay and conditions, let's sort that out. But you cannot just then say, oh, everybody should come out and strike regardless of what their individual position is. So I think that sort of thing has to stop.
Well, little acorns, we've got you on board with the postal workers' strike. We'll have you on board with the general strike by the end of the month, I'm sure.
Well, I'll just remind you earlier on in the show, Paul, you were saying that the private sector does some things well, so I saw that as a personal victory as well.
I've always said that. No, absolutely true, it does. And we don't talk about it in the Labour movement, we don't talk about the private sector enough. That's certainly true. Well,
thank you so much to those of you who've got in touch. We've got loads more of your views. We'll try and get to some more of them later on in the show, and do keep them coming in for that very reason. Now, 11 leadership hustings, 11 have taken place this summer, with Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak battling up and down the country to win votes and indeed the keys to number 10. As we approach the final showdown in London this Wednesday, Arlene, who have you been more impressed by? I don't think this will be a surprise to anyone who follows you on Twitter.
Yes, absolutely. Well, last Sunday I said that I believe that Liz Truss was the choice out of the two candidates that are left in the race. Obviously, from the point of view of Northern Ireland, and from the point of view of the Union overall, she has been very clear around all of that. She's posted herself as a child of the Union. She wants to deal with the Northern Ireland Protocol in a proactive way. There have been reports this week that her team are looking at triggering Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol to have a renegotiation. I think that would be very helpful, given that just this week tariffs on steel were imposed at 25% from steel that is moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. So just take that into consideration. Internally in the United Kingdom, if you move steel from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, there's a 25% tariff. And that's as a result of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So, yes, I think that in terms of who's going into number 10, I would prefer to see Liz Truss going into number 10 to deal with all of those issues and to sort out what is a threat to the Union, and that, of course, is the Northern Ireland Protocol.
There's one clear vote for Liz there from Arlene. Paul, I'm going to ask you, you're not allowed to get out of it, you're not allowed to say none of the above, you're not allowed to spoil your ballot. If you had to choose between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss going in, who would you most like to see?
That is asking me to choose whether I want influenza or pneumonia. Come on, Deanna, that's something which is a slightly more civilised metaphor than the one that Barry Gardiner used on the show last week. I would probably, if you put a gun to my head, I would probably go for Rishi Sunak, actually, simply because I was quite impressed with the way that he worked with the trade union movement at the beginning of the pandemic in terms of agreeing the furlough scheme and stuff. But that's the only thing really that counts in his favour for me. I would just say, Deanna, can your lot just please put us out of our misery? I mean, it has become, frankly, a bit stale now, and I think most of the country just want it done and dealt with so that we can then get into the serious business of what we're going to do to tackle the cost of living crisis and to make sure that people can heat their homes this winter. That is a serious point. You know, it's time to get this thing wrapped up and moved on to the big issues confronting families every day in their lives.
Well, it's the last hustings on Wednesday, and then I think at that point no more votes kind of cast will be valid. They're going to be counted and all totted up, and then finally, a week tomorrow we will actually have that result. But it has felt like years, not sort of 6 to 8 weeks. It's honestly felt like years.
And you're a Tory MP.
I know.
The rest of us feel.
But you made a really serious point there, Paul, though, that whilst this has been going on, and I think it was the right thing that there was a leadership contest, I really do, but I do think we should definitely have truncated it and made it shorter, just given the pressures that the country's facing at the moment. Let's talk about the hustings, Arlene, because I think, you know, the point of having so many, having them all over the country is so that Conservative members, who are the electorate, can go and see the candidates in person. But given that they're all available kind of to stream online, do you think they've got a bit stale and that there's actually kind of been nothing new at any of them, certainly in the last few?
Oh, well, that's the point. They're delivering the same message. And I can understand why they're delivering the same message, depending on whether they're in Northern Ireland or Scotland or Wales or England. And they're bringing forward what they see as the way forward. But it has become stale, Diana. Let's be honest about it, because each of them are being reported on by the press. And when the candidates come out and give the same message, they're going to level up Northern Ireland, they're going to level up Newcastle. You know, it's just the same message, but with the hustings venue inserted therein. And so I think it feels like a long time because it has happened over the summer. There hasn't been anything else going on politically in terms of the House of Commons isn't sitting during the summer, and therefore this is the only show in town. People are not getting any other news, but it should have been truncated. It's clear that Liz Truss is well ahead in the polls, and I totally accept that you don't just go in the polls, you have to have the actual result, but that result could have been taken before now, and we could have hit the ground running, you know, mid-August instead of now. It's going to be at the start of September.
Yeah, it surely would have made more sense to have it done over the summer so they could appoint a cabinet, kind of settle in before Parliament comes back in September, but anyway, what do I know? What do I know? Let's move on now, because Rishi Sunak has said that the UK government gave too much power to scientists during COVID lockdowns, adding they were not honest about the potential downsides. Former Chancellor also said it was wrong to scare people with posters showing COVID patients on ventilators. Scientists have hit back at the comments, insisting that ministers were responsible for decisions made throughout the pandemic. And Boris Johnson's former top aide, Dominic Cummings, said Sunak was talking dangerous rubbish. Paul, you just made a very small pitch there for Rishi Sunak. Do you think he is talking dangerous rubbish, to quote Dominic Cummings?
No, I think he's got a point. I think he's right on this, actually. The only thing I would say is he's a bit of a Johnny-come-lately to this debate. Perhaps if he'd have said it at the time, and perhaps a bit more publicly than when he's in a leadership election, we might have taken it a bit more seriously. I mean, the truth is, I think government did at the time allow experts, scientific experts, to rule the roost too much. I mean, of course, you take advice from experts, and you know the reason they're experts is because they know a lot about their particular field, whether in this case it was medicine, science, or whatever. But what you then, it strikes me, what you then have to do as a government is to say, right, this is what these people have advised us about their particular field of work. Now, what we have to do as the people running the country is to work out what is the best thing for the country. How do we take that advice and apply it? What will the effects of that advice be in terms of the functioning of the country? What will it mean for the economy? What will it mean for people's jobs? What will it mean for people's health and so on? And it seems to me that the government didn't do that two-stage approach. What it effectively said is, this is what the scientists have said, therefore that's what we're going to do. And I suspect, Deanna, I said on the show previously, that when it comes to the more extreme restrictions that we saw in lockdown, and you read back now about some of the restrictions, it is breathtaking what we allowed the government to do to personal liberties and freedoms, etc. I suspect in a few years' time, it will be like the Iraq War. You will not be able to find a politician or commentator who said, yeah, actually, I supported all of that stuff. It was absolutely the right thing to do at the time. I think they will slowly resile from it as the evidence against it, as it is doing now, slowly builds up. And I think this is probably what Rishi Sunak is doing at the moment.
And Arlene, I see you nodding there, but I want to kind of draw on your experience as First Minister, because there's the old adage, isn't there, that kind of advisors advise and ministers decide. And as Paul rightly highlighted, you can't decide those things in a silo, can you? It has to be based on knock-on impact right across society. So do you think it's a little bit strange that kind of Rishi's made these remarks when actually he was actually at the table in the so-called quad making these decisions?
Well, you have to remember a couple of things. First of all, the first lockdown, everybody was scared witless by what was coming out, and you can understand why we took the decisions that we did at that particular time. But as time went on, some of us in devolved administrations would be asking questions about the impact on small businesses, on older people, on our younger people, and we were dismissed as killing people. I mean, it was a start of that, not just from some of our colleagues in government, but from some of the media as well, and most of the mainstream media, to be fair. And fear was the tool that was used in all of this. So for Rishi to say it was wrong to scare people, yes, it was wrong to scare people, but that was the tool that was used by government at that particular point in time. And we were, in quotes, led by the science. We were led by the science. We weren't even led by the science. We were led by a number of scientists who had a particular view. Of course, there was another view at the time, but that view wasn't allowed to come to the fore because it was seen as dangerous again. And I think Rishi, to be fair to him, was bound by cabinet responsibility at the time. He may well have been making all of these points internally in cabinet, as some of us were. But the reality is now he's coming out and saying X and Y was wrong. Don't forget there's a public inquiry coming up, Diana. And I think people will want to position themselves in getting ready for the public inquiry. And of course, the benefit of hindsight is a wonderful thing. And we know all of that. But at the time of the first lockdown, as I say, I think it was the right thing to do at the first lockdown. But then as time went on, as we could see the impact it was having on older people, on younger people, on our businesses, on socialisation, on people's mental health, other issues should have come to the fore, and there should have been more of a balance achieved in what we were doing. There will be lessons to be learned, that favourite phrase of government ministers everywhere. But it'll be very interesting to see where the public inquiry takes us, and I've no doubt I'll be in front of that public inquiry, as well as all of the other government ministers across the UK. So it will be, I think it'll be good to have a public inquiry, to have a look at what the decisions were at the particular point in time. But certainly from my point of view, I think there was too much weight given to the science that was put in front of us as ministers, and we weren't given enough weight to other things. Look at the cancer deaths now. Look at the excess deaths that are coming to the fore. It is something that should have been considered at that particular point in time.
Absolutely. Well, certainly, I think there must be a lot of lessons learned from it. But, absolutely all hoping that we never have to face anything quite like this pandemic again. Well, stay with us, because coming up after the break, we're going to be joined by the legendary broadcaster Alastair Stewart to talk about his show coming up at 12 o'clock. So don't go anywhere.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain every Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m. A news hour that comes with a trigger warning. Scorching hot opinion with prominent guests saying the unsayable, and a little bit of weekend fun thrown in. Unlike other broadcasters, I won't be forgetting what the B in our name stands for. So howie in for Real Britain Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Co.
Welcome back to the Political Correction. Well, coming up at midday is broadcasting legend Alastair Stewart, and we're delighted to say that we're now joined in the studio by Alastair to look ahead to his show at 12 o'clock. So, Alastair, we've spent a lot of time today talking about cost of living, and I understand you're going to be starting with that on your show?
Well, we are... No, we're not, actually, no. I'll tell you what we're starting with. I'll come back to that in a second, but an absolutely intriguing letter in the Mail on Sunday from the leader of the Conservative Party in Wales, Andrew T Davies, the chair of the Conservatives in Northern Ireland, who's also been on the programme before, and also a leading light of the Scottish Conservatives all coming out for Liz Truss. And I think that is quite significant because in effect, she said, I stand by the union, but so is Rishi, and the party is called the Conservative and Unionist Party, so what's that all about? And I really want to find out why they feel that way. I'm also interested to know whether that's them as individuals declaring, or whether they've taken soundings of the party in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, because I think in what is a democratic election for ordinary members of the Conservative Party, that actually matters. So I think that should be quite fun. But you're absolutely right on the cost of living thing. Still with the Liz Truss thing, the Telegraph, Sunday Telegraph calls it the nuclear option, briefing that there would be a significant cut in VAT. Sunak comes out and says, oh, it's regressive, it would be dreadful, because clearly the more you spend, a cut in VAT means the more you gain from it. But to me, what really matters is that it's a straightforward option rather than a check in the post or a boost to benefits. It's saying to you, me and everybody else, you can keep a little bit more of your money when you go shopping because VAT will have come down. And most significantly, she's also toying, if we're to believe what is a leak after all, increasing the thresholds, the amount of money we can all earn before we pay any income tax, and the point at which we start paying higher rates of income tax. Absolutely profound economics and profound politics. So I've asked Julian Jessup back, who was on our programme yesterday. He's an independent economic commentator, at absolute top of his game, in my humble opinion, but also he used to work in the Treasury. So I want to try and figure out how this came about, whether it would work. And he's tweeted already this morning that he thinks in the main it's kind of 7 out of 10 already. So we're going to probe a little bit on that. We've also got another good friend of the programme on talking about school uniforms for small people going back to school. Not obviously the ghost children, who we talked to Bob Halford about yesterday, but those that will be going. And I can remember when I was at school, my parents had to buy this long list of uniform from one supplier. I mean, it was a stinking monopoly, but in those days we didn't really realise it. But now you can go to supermarkets, you can go to all over the place to buy it. But there are bargains to be had. And for hard-pressed families with kids, it's a big budget item. So, yeah, all sorts of things to play for.
Lots of schools, I know from experience, will have, if you like, hand-me-downs. So kids who have left that school will, you know, give their uniform, their parents will donate.
My missus used to regularly do that.
Which is a great idea, really.
Yeah, well, we had two that were 3 years apart, and then we got 2 younger down, but they're 4 years apart. And absolutely, you know,
and even to other children as well, saying to the school, look, you know, we don't need this anymore. If there's
I think there's also is the branding thing, and we know in every walk of life branding matters, and that is whether you have to buy the pre-made red sweater, let's say, that says School X, hockey club, rugby club, football club, whatever, or whether you can buy a red sweater and then put a badge on it. And that's reasonable, but it's a cheaper way of doing it. So there are various tricks that can be had, We had to have boaters as well. But that was because I went to that sort of school, and I had to have my boater. No, it was called St Augustine's Abbey School. It was so dreadful, it doesn't exist anymore, thank God for that. But it was a small Benedictine school. My dad was Catholic, he was in the Air Force, so he wanted us to go to boarding school, and he was Catholic. But this boater had to be made because my cranium is so large, for no obvious reason.
Were you ever the victim of corporal punishment?
Yes, but not paedophilia. Insofar as I can...
that's a good thing.
No, I think it's a crucial distinction. I had a very good friend of mine whose wife helps run Hickstead show jumping. His brother was a victim of paedophilia, and you shouldn't make light of these things at all. But he himself chose to. He said, I wasn't. Maybe they just didn't fancy me. But, I mean, that was his game. No, I think... of the private schools in those days, and we're talking about the late 60s, early 70s, particularly the religious ones, corporal punishment, it wasn't just a part of the discipline schedule. I think there was something profoundly weird about the conduct of it and the kicks
you will remember
the monks got out of it.
You will
just
remember
really horrible.
Paul Foote from Daily Mirror, the Daily Mirror, Paul Foote, that great campaigning journalist. And he went to the famous private school, Shrewsbury School, and he said that his headmaster was kind of into that all of the time, corporal punishment, but not just for reasons of discipline. In the end, it just became gratuitous, and you had to wonder if there was another sinister reason.
I can't, off the top of my head, remember the name, but there is a brilliant book which someone has written about their time. Hasn't Ian Wilson person also written one recently about what happened to him at prep school. It was the same. But it is the fact that for some people you kind of shrug it off and that, never hurt me. But for a lot of people, it does cause genuinely profound psychological damage later on in life. But I think the guys who were into it were just plain weird.
I can't believe you ever did anything so bad that you
smoked like a chimney, as you well
still
know.
do. Come on,
was the main thing. And I do remember telling the Italian head boy in very Anglo-Saxon rather than Italian language what he could do with himself, and that was judged to be inappropriate.
Know your place, Alistair, as a head boy.
Yeah, quite right, too.
And you became involved, obviously, with the National Union of Students, I think, didn't you? After school, obviously. Was that driven by what you'd experienced at school? Did you become a bit of a rebel?
No, I don't know. It was a brilliant question, because actually I think I left the sixth form and didn't do a gap year. My parents didn't have enough money in those days to let me endure that kind of luxury, and went to Bristol University in the October of the year that I got my A-levels. And it was within the first few months that my mind was open to politics, and I met people who became really good friends in the Conservative Party, in the Labour Party. Had no memory of the Liberal Party at all in those days, funnily enough. But both the Labour lot and the Tory lot were fascinating, and I loved the ideas. And in fact, in those days, it was the Labour Party lot, and particularly the Labour Party economics of John Maynard Keynes and that kind of stuff, that hooked me, which I was studying academically as well. So I was, NUS, broad left, and then I got a big mortgage.
And those were the days when the NUS believed in free and open debate and didn't try to...
if you're interested in that one, it's heartbreaking, because some really towering figures like Dave Aronovich, who writes for The Times, the great Trevor Phillips, who writes for The Times and The Mail, an awful lot of us, Mike Gapes, still suffering from the Labour Party's attitude towards freedom of speech and anti-Semitism and things like that. All of us were profoundly upset at the way in which the National Union of Students had gone. It ain't what it used to be, and it jolly well should be, because it does matter. And for many people like me, it is your first introduction to grown-up politics.
Absolutely.
And it needs to be conducted properly, but also the attitude towards these big issues like freedom of speech and racism and anti-Semitism need to be grown up as well.
Completely. Well, we've strayed a bit from your show there, Alistair.
He always does that, and that's why I love coming in here. You see, you ask the good questions and we go down that, and then he pipes in with something from over there.
Elbow in. But anyway...
I'm going to go for a whiskey with him afterwards and sit in front of the fire and just chew the cud.
Sit there smoking.
Great to see both of you, and thanks for having me on.
Likewise, and obviously tune in at 12 o'clock for Alistair Stewart and friends. Some really big stuff there. I think the economic coverage there from Julian Jessop's going to be really, really valuable, so do tune in and don't go anywhere. You've just got time for a brew after we're finished, and then back at 12 for Alistair. But stick with us, because we're going to go to a little break and a little bit of news.
Thank you. Quick look at the headlines for you on GB News this morning. The Prime Minister says a huge package of financial support will be delivered to help struggling households through the energy crisis this winter. Writing in the Daily Mail, Boris Johnson acknowledged bills will be eye-watering over the next few months, and it's going to be tough. But he said colossal sums of taxpayers' money is already being used to help people, and his successor will announce more support next month. Meanwhile, the two Tory leadership candidates are yet to reveal exactly how they plan to ease the cost of living crisis. But Rishi Sunak's team has criticised reports that Liz Truss plans to cut VAT by 5%. It's understood the Foreign Secretary has discussed a nuclear option with her advisers, which would reportedly save the average household more than £1,300 a year. But Mr Sunak's campaign says the move would cost more than £30 billion. Meanwhile, Ms Truss has vowed to bolster Britain's defences if she becomes Prime Minister, saying the era of complacency is over. She wants to push ahead with renewing Trident and strengthen support for intelligence services as part of her plan to protect the UK. And more than 25,000 migrants have crossed the English Channel so far this year. That's after 915 people were intercepted just yesterday. The Ministry of Defence saying they were on board 19 small boats. Monday saw the highest daily total on record, with 1,295 people making the treacherous journey from France. That's it. You're up to date on TV, online, on DAB Radio Plus. This is GB News. Don't go anywhere. Diana will be back in just a bit.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction, and loads of you getting in touch. As always, thank you to all of you for sending your views in. Where shall we begin? Paul, do you want to kick us off today?
Yeah, on the strikes, John says, I vote Conservative, and I have to say the Postal Union leader, that's Terry Pullinger, who we had on the show earlier, is spot on, and I fully agree with him. We've seen our utilities deliver for their shareholders whilst dumping sewage in the sea. You'd get fined £1,000 for letting your dog poo on the beach. Our infrastructure has been sold off to offshore companies.
Arlene?
So Dominic says that strikes are our best tool to beat the billionaires, bosses and bigots. And Marianne says, I think in the current financial climate, it is selfish and short-sighted of the unions to strike. Whilst I can somewhat relate to their reasons, the wider public are facing huge challenges too at the moment, and we need everyone to pull together to save us from going into a deep recession. So it's good to get a broad swathe of opinions this morning, as ever, Deanna and Paul.
Always, yeah, no, we love to see it. And that's what I love about GB News. It is the home of debate and broad opinions. So thank you for sharing them. So again, on strikes, we have John here who says, Paul says to nationalise the energy industry because it's so important. So the unions would be able to demand anything they want and there's nothing the rest of us can do about it. Paul, quick response.
Slightly cynical. I think there are lots of good reasons for taking essential utilities into public ownership, and you know, I think whether it's a Labour government or a Tory government in charge, if a union makes a demand that the country and the government regards as unreasonable, then whether or not it's publicly owned or privately owned won't make much difference to the response, in my view.
Well, thank you for sharing your views. We'll try and get to a few more before we finish, but now we're going to move on to our regular feature, Common Ground, where we discuss the issues and social ideas that bring our country together. And for today's Common Ground, we're joined by the director of Maidenhead Synagogue, Dr. Jonathan Remain. Thank you for joining us this morning. I understand you want to cover initially something that we started our show with today, and that is energy and cost of living.
Yes, well, that's been on everybody's minds, hasn't it? But I want to tackle it from a religious angle, which is slightly different, because it affects churches and synagogues and mosques up and down the country, both positively and negatively. I mean, the negative thing is that, of course, people are going to have less cash and therefore may not be able to drive or catch the bus to their place of worship. So attendance will go down. Plus, of course, people may not be able to make their weekly donation or an annual donation or whatever they do. But on the other hand, expenses for heating those buildings are going to go up, particularly for churches, which often have old, sort of lofty buildings, very drafty. So they're going to face a double whammy of less income but higher expenditure. Now, on the positive side, it's actually religious buildings that may be able to play a role, quite apart from what the politicians do with the economics, because they can be safe places, warm places. And what we're going to be doing in Maidenhead, and I'm sure local churches will do up and down the country, is just open up during the day so people can have a warm place to go to. Not just to go to, but also to chat to, because, you know, that old saying, a problem shared is a problem halved. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. And being able to talk about the problems is important, and particularly if people are in debt, because as you well know, one of the major things about combating debt is to admit you're in debt in the first place, rather than just sort of shoving away all those nasty letters, and being able to talk about it. And then, again, religious buildings can perhaps be a signpost to debt relief organisations for people who have never had to consider debt before, but are now having to do so. So it's a very positive role that religious buildings, who are the sort of artery of the country in a sense, because they're in every town and village, quite apart from the cities, that they can play.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've heard a lot from the... Apologies. We've heard a lot from the Conservative leadership contenders, haven't we, around energy and cost of living? And I understand the leadership contest is your second discussion point for the day.
Yes, I should, by the way, can I just tail end the first point about the energy crisis? Because I think we actually also need to reframe it and not just see it as a matter of gas and electricity, but as part of a war effort. I mean, obviously, it's the Ukrainians who are on the front line. But the reality is that British people are part of the backup campaign, and we're facing a different sort of fight. And it's almost a bit like the Second World War, when people had to have rationing and curfews and blackouts. It's almost on par with that, and that's really, I think, we need to see ourselves as part of that war effort. And yes, it hurts, and yes, there's a sacrifice, but this is part of a bigger picture, and that maybe will give us a little bit of sort of comfort to know that it's not just about us; it's about us playing our role in helping a nation defend itself against the big bully. But yeah, to move on to the leadership contest, I have to say I've really been disappointed in the lack of big ideas. We're getting a lot of sort of minutiae. Liz Truss talking about abolishing the Green Levy, or Rishi Sunak talking about fines if you miss your NHS appointment. And what I really want is a vision. I mean, whether people like them or not, David Cameron, he talked about the big society. It failed, of course, but it was, aspiration. Boris Johnson talked about levelling up. Well, I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but certainly it was an inspiring idea. And I think we need this sort of bigger picture idea, because, particularly what's happening in the country, not just now, but, the last 6 years, 2 years of divisive Brexit debate, then another 2 years of the COVID pandemic and lockdown, now the financial crisis. I think we need something to carry us through, to inspire us, and also to bind us together as a country. So that's what I'm missing, that bigger picture, that sense of vision.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly when one of them gets the keys to number 10, hopefully that first speech outside number 10 will set out some kind of vision that as a country we can get behind. But I think, it goes back to your first point there. I think that immediate pressure on cost of living probably is going to be at the forefront of people's minds at the moment. As a bit of a distraction, though, a lot of us kind of watch telly to try and wind down, to kind of get away from real life. And I know there's been a TV show that's kind of caught your imagination, isn't there? The TV show Marriage?
Yes, this is with Nicola Walker and Sean Bean, which divided opinion enormously. Some people said it was the most boring thing they've ever seen. Others said it was very refreshing. I think what was great about it was it tackled marriage from a realistic point of view. It wasn't glamorous Hollywood fluff on the one hand, nor was it a sort of a horrible dissection of a marriage that was falling apart and screaming rows, nor, by the way, was it sort of an object of comedy. What it was is very realistic, sometimes very staid, and it really sort of emphasised that marriage is about partnership, shared experiencing. And as a rabbi, something I do, of course, is marry people. And I always do the course beforehand for the couple, sort of pre-marriage guidance before it's needed. I never talk about love because that's far too vague. And what I talk about is much more hard-edged and measurable qualities, such as sort of the 4 things they almost have to have a checklist for, that they know their partner, that they respect their partner, trust their partner, and also like their partner. And if you've got those 4 things, know, respect, trust, like, well, there's no guarantee of success, but it means you're sort of got a very solid basis. Because at the end of the day, marriage is probably the biggest gamble that any of us ever take in our lives. Trying to predict how we feel in 20, 30 years' time. It's quite ridiculous, really, but we do it. And so often, unfortunately, it goes wrong. But I think if we've got those 4 ingredients, then we've got a sort of a good chance of beating the divorce statistics.
They certainly sound like 4 very sensible ingredients to me. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Dr. Jonathan Romain there, Director of Maidenhead Synagogue, joining us for Common Ground to share his thoughts on some of the latest stories this week. Now, yesterday, the Shadow Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, Lucy Powell, posted a picture on social media in which she was wearing a T-shirt with the words, "Never kissed a Tory." And this was at the Manchester Pride March. Paul, was it a sensible fashion choice? Have you ever worn a Never Kissed a Tory T-shirt?
Glad you didn't ask me if I ever actually have kissed a Tory.
I was tempted, but I didn't know if you'd answer.
No comment. I like Lucy. I think she's a good MP, but I think this was a bad move. I mean, I don't think we should necessarily get out of our pram over it, but it did smack to me a bit of student politics. It's not the sort of thing I don't think that a professional politician in a party that aspires to lead the country should engage in. Bearing in mind she's quite a prominent senior MP in the Labour Party as well. And I just think, look, when you do this sort of stuff, you have to think, who am I trying to appeal to here? Am I just trying to appeal to my base, or do I need to appeal to a much broader layer of people because, hey, we want to win a general election? And the truth is, if Labour is going to win a general election, it is going to need to win over millions of people who voted Tory last time, and you're not going to do that by giving the impression, frankly, that you hate Tories. So a bad move by Lucy, I think.
And Arlene, what did you make of it? I guess on the one hand, it's maybe trying to engage younger Labour voters to have a bit more of a kind of fun image, but for me, it was just juvenile.
Well, it's juvenile and goes against what Pride is supposed to be about, which is to be inclusive. And it's also concerning to see at the Pride Parade in Cardiff, for example, the police actually stopping some lesbians from marching because they had a different point of view from others in the parade, which I think was quite telling, is it not, about the state of LGBT at the moment. But it's juvenile. She shouldn't have done it. She's a shadow Secretary of State. And I think, anyway, she should amend it to say never knowingly kissed a Tory, because are you seriously telling me that people ask in nightclubs and what have you whether what their voting preference is before they snog them? Things might have changed since I was in a nightclub.
Well, these days, I think you have to wear a lanyard, don't you, that states kind of your political allegiance when you enter, just to make sure it's a safe space.
I always keep my Labour Party membership card with me. I'll just display it in case anyone's particularly deserving.
I bet that's good for pulling that, isn't it, Paul?
I shouldn't say that as a married man. I'm talking about years gone by, obviously.
Yeah, of course. Well, there we go.
Say no, respect, trust, love.
Well, anyway, certainly not a T-shirt that I would be wearing, because Tories are fantastic. And I would say very good kisses as well, but maybe I'm biased. Anyway, it's time now to look at some of the biggest stories from the world of sport. And we're delighted to be joined in the studio by broadcaster and writer Aidan McGee. Aidan, let's talk about Liverpool and Bournemouth.
Oh, goodness me, yeah.
What a match.
Crisis on Monday. They lose to Manchester United. Nobody really saw that one coming.
Yeah.
I mean, we were saying on here the other week when we were talking about United being in crisis, they've got Liverpool coming up next. That'll be 3 defeats in a row. Didn't work out that way. Liverpool didn't play that badly on the night, but they needed a response. But to get 9 goals is one hell of a response. I mean, it's only the 4th time it's happened in Premier League history. We've seen it happen 3 times in the last 3 seasons. Southampton lost 9-0 at home to Leicester 3 seasons ago. They lost 9-0 at Southampton, 9-0 at Manchester United as well. So United did it back in 1995 when they beat Ipswich 9-0. Prior to that, it was 89, I think, when Liverpool beat Palace famously. Now,
the QPR never been on the receiving end of the
No.
I'm amazed at that.
Our biggest top-flight defeat in the last 35 years was Sheffield Wednesday away, March 1987.
He knows his stuff, this boy, doesn't he?
He does. That's why we get him on.
There was a guy called Gavin Peacock who scored our goal that day, and he was really happy, even though we lost 7-1. But anyway, that's another story. So yeah, look, it was a huge win yesterday. I mean, Roberto Firmino got a hat-trick. He also set up 3 goals as well.
Yep.
Jurgen Klopp went and had a word with Scott Parker, the Bournemouth manager, and just said, you're not going to be on the receiving end of this every week. You ran into us on a really, really special day.
Yeah.
But it was only Liverpool's first win of the season. United went and won at Southampton. We were wondering after that fantastic win on Monday whether that was just a night when the big players came to the party. Could they do it every single week? Could you go to Southampton on 12 o'clock on a Saturday, 12:30? They've got that horrible lime kit on as well. And so lime green kit. They got a result, 56
It's a
minute goals.
vile kit. They all look like keepers' jerseys, don't they?
They do a bit. I mean, I think if you ask traditional supporters, they will say they'd like to see United play probably in white shirt, black shorts, white socks. But the marketeers at all these big companies like Adidas and Nike see differently. And yeah,
it's so commercially driven, isn't it? I mean, nowadays lots of teams have got third kits.
Well, you have to have a third kit. You have to.
Is that a regulation?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was funny.
It's a nonsense, though. Isn't it?
About 5 years
the whole point
ago.
of the second kit is that if there is a clash, you use your second kit.
Sometimes QPR had obviously blue and white hoops as their home kit, and then brought out a blue and white away kit. So there was no one. Anyway, this I was at Crystal Palace's kit launch about 3 or 4 years ago, and I said to the chairman, Steve Parrish, I said, when are you releasing the third kit? And he went, third kit? You what? And I went, yeah, you got to have a third kit.
He didn't know?
He didn't. Well, he claimed that he did. But then suddenly there was a third kit that was released the following week. But it is Premier League rules. You have to have a third one. Man United started all this nonsense back in the 90s, and they had 4 kits.
And now, as you know, Aidan, it's every season now teams are changing their kits. And when you consider how much they cost, that puts a lot of pressure on, because kids are obviously always going to want the latest kit.
But it's a bit of a misnomer, because actually most shirts are sold to adults.
Is that right?
If you look at the price of kits in the early 90s compared to what they are now, they've had a bit of an increase recently, but up until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, they'd only gone up by about £8 to £10. So either they were really expensive back in the early 90s. I mean, they're basically made of polyester anyway. I mean,
I'm probably bitter because I've just forked out about 150 quid for a Wolves top for my boy and a Chelsea top for my girl.
I think Wolves is a good case in point, because last season they brought out this Portuguese kit. It had no relation to tradition or anything like that. And yes, they've got a bit of a Portuguese influence at the club, but it just annoys supporters. If you're a Blades fan, I'm sure you'd be you want to see them playing in their traditional colours, don't you?
Oh, if red and white disappeared, I would be furious, furious. I just want to talk about one more match, because I actually tuned into Match of the Day in news that will shock both chaps on the sofa here.
I'm amazed you were in on a Saturday night.
I know, right? It happens from time to time. Man City versus Palace. Man City were so skillful. It was a 4-2. Haaland scored his hat-trick.
Yeah, look, it was magnificent. He's going to be a magnificent striker. 6 goals in 4 games now. No great surprise there. He had the pedigree coming into it. His father played for Manchester City, played international football. It's not a huge surprise to me that he's tearing up the Premier League. What I would say, though, I think that's 4 times in about the last 7 games when City have had to come from 2-0 down. You cannot do it every single time. Yeah. I'm not saying Manchester City are unable to achieve something. There's no limit to what they can do this season. But if you keep giving yourself that handicap of taking a 2-0 deficit, then sooner or later someone's going to hold that lead. And if you only has to happen 2 or 3 times in a season, and then suddenly the teams around you are catching you. That's how vicious the Premier League can be.
So it's hard to look beyond City at the moment for the title, isn't it? Given, I mean, I know Liverpool had a fantastic performance yesterday, but just a little blip of 2 or 3 games, because the standard is so high now, it can make the difference between being up there or not.
Remember the days back in the 90s and 2000s when United would start a bit slow, they'd click into around about October, and then they'd never look back, and it could happen with Chelsea as well. Well, when Mourinho first came into Chelsea, he said, no, we're going from day one. And then by the time we got to October and United got themselves ready, they're already 8 points clear. So you have to take every game seriously from day one. So there's not really much room for any slipping up. And, City could prove that this season. They've made the better start. They came back from 3-1 down against Newcastle the other day. I'm not expecting a fascinating title race this year, but Arsenal have won 4 games in a row now, so they might be part of the conversation for top 4.
Let's talk about Djokovic.
Yeah, so we've known for a while that he probably wouldn't be able to gain entry to the US Open at Flushing Meadow, which starts tomorrow. Over his vaccine status, we had the whole furore around Australia back in January. We spoke about it on here, didn't we, at length. So Rafa Nadal's been saying, look, this is very sad. The competition is bigger than the player, than any player, and we've had lots of Grand Slams in the last 15, 20 years, Nadal, Djokovic, Murray, whoever. who weren't able to play. We just recently at Wimbledon, Daniel Medvedev, the world number 1, wasn't able to play there. I'm not saying he would have gone to win it, but to win it, you like to see your best players there.
And if you are one of the top players, you want to prove that you can beat the best as well, don't you?
It harms the tournament, it harmed the Australian Open. Their stance on vaccines harmed the competition because although Rafa Nadal won it in a thrilling final against Daniel Medvedev, I still believe Novak Djokovic would have won that tournament. It's the one he's always dominant in. He would have gone into the USA. He came back after a lengthy break since last September in Grand Slams and won Wimbledon, having beat Kyrgios in the final. So I think he'd have a good chance in the US Open. I don't think Nadal's comfortable going on to try and win his 24th Grand Slam with the best players not being around him. And he's always said that throughout his career. He wants to win against the top players.
Well, there we go. Sport going mad. All sorts of discussions here on the Political Correction as always. And thank you to all of you for getting in touch, joining us from home, sharing your views on the stories that we've been discussing today. That is it from us here on the Political Correction. But don't you go anywhere, because earlier we were speaking to Alistair Stewart about his show coming up in just a few minutes. So go make yourself a brew, get yourself settled in for the wonderful Alistair Stewart and friends, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Well, let's have a look at the weather for you, and it's going to be a cloudy morning for Scotland with some rain, brighter elsewhere with sunny breaks. Here are the details.
Well, starting off in the southwest, and whilst there will be some higher level cloud, keeping the sunshine a little hazy, it will be mostly bright and a warm day.
It's a similar picture further east and around the capital. There'll be some warm sunny breaks in the cloud with highs in the mid-20s.
Then heading back westwards over to Wales, and here it will be mostly dry and often bright or sunny with just a small chance of a shower.
In the Midlands then, there'll be plenty of fine and bright weather, some warm sunny breaks. Similarly to yesterday, there may be the odd shower around, but for most, it's going to stay pretty dry.
The same can be said for northeast England. Again, it will be mostly fine afternoon, but you can't